In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where the wind carries whispers of ancient warriors and the rocks themselves seem to watch, a legend was born that would haunt Navy SEALs for years to come. They called her the Native Ghost, a shadow that moved through the landscape like smoke, striking from impossible distances with a precision that defied human capability. Her weapon of choice was not some high-tech military rifle, but a vintage Winchester Model 70, a hunting rifle that belonged in a grandfather's gun cabinet, not on a battlefield where modern warfare demanded the latest technology. The first reports seemed impossible. A single shot from over 2 miles away, taking down a target that even the most advanced military snipers would struggle to hit. The bullet traveled for nearly 8 seconds through thin mountain air, accounting for wind drift, altitude, and the curvature of the Earth itself. When the ballistics team ran the calculations, they stared at their computers in disbelief. The math didn't lie, but it painted a picture of a shooter whose skills transcended anything they had encountered in decades of modern warfare. What made this story even more extraordinary was not just the distance of the shot, but who pulled the trigger. In a region where women were forbidden from even holding weapons, where tradition and law conspired to keep them invisible and silent, someone had defied every expectation. The Ghost moved through territories that seasoned warriors fear to enter, navigating tribal politics and ancient feuds with an understanding that came from being born to this land. She knew every ridge, every valley, every hiding spot that had been used by fighters for generations. The SEALs who encountered her tracks spoke in hushed tones about footprints that seemed to appear and disappear without explanation, about positions that provided perfect fields of fire, yet seemed impossible to reach. Intelligence officers pored over satellite images and drone footage, trying to understand how a single individual could consistently outmaneuver some of the most elite forces in the world. The technology that gave American forces their overwhelming advantage seemed useless against someone who fought with the wisdom of the mountains themselves. But this was not just a story about an impossible shot or an elusive enemy. It was about the collision of two worlds, the high-tech precision of modern military operations and the timeless knowledge of people who had been fighting in these mountains since before recorded history. The Native Ghost represented something that no amount of training could replicate, an intimate connection to the battlefield that went beyond tactics and equipment. She was part of the landscape itself, and the landscape was on her side. As word of the 3,700-meter kill spread through military channels, it sparked debates that reached the highest levels of command. How could a single shooter with an old hunting rifle outperform snipers equipped with the most advanced weaponry available? What did this say about the nature of modern warfare, where technology was supposed to provide absolute superiority? The questions were uncomfortable because they suggested that perhaps the greatest advantages could not be bought, manufactured, or taught in any training facility. The hunt for the Native Ghost became more than a military operation. It became a quest to understand something that challenged every assumption about warfare in the 21st century. Each encounter left more questions than answers, more respect than frustration. The SEALs found themselves not just chasing an enemy, but pursuing a mystery that forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about combat, about skill, and about the land they were fighting in. This is the story of that hunt, and the extraordinary individual who reminded the world's most elite warriors that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not technology, but the wisdom to become one with the battlefield itself. The morning mist clung to the Afghan mountainside like a living thing, rolling through valleys that had witnessed centuries of conflict. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his scope for the third time, scanning the ridgeline 2,000 meters away. His team of Navy SEALs had been in position since before dawn, waiting for intelligence reports to materialize into actionable targets. The mission briefing had been routine: eliminate high-value targets moving through the walking corridor, a narrow strip of Afghanistan that jutted into China like an accusing finger. Morrison had completed over 200 missions in his 12-year career, from the streets of Fallujah to the caves of Tora Bora. He had seen enough combat to know when something felt different, and this morning carried an electric tension that made his experienced team unusually quiet. Even Sergeant Rodriguez, normally quick with gallows humor, kept his observations to himself as they settled into their overwatch position. The intelligence had come from multiple sources: satellite imagery, human intelligence, and intercepted communications, all pointing to a convoy of Taliban commanders using this remote route to avoid drone surveillance. The corridor was perfect for such movement, surrounded by peaks so high that air support was limited and ground pursuit nearly impossible. It was exactly the kind of terrain where America's technological advantages meant little, and where patience and precision became the deciding factors. Staff Sergeant Chun, the team's designated marksman, was the first to spot movement. Through his high-powered scope, he watched a line of figures moving along a trail that seemed to emerge from the mountain itself. The distance was significant, nearly 2,800 meters, but well within the capabilities of his .338 Lapua Magnum rifle. He began calculating wind speed, temperature, and altitude corrections while Morrison coordinated with their Tactical Operations Center. The convoy consisted of 7 individuals, moving with the confidence of people who believed themselves beyond the reach of their enemies. They carried themselves like leaders rather than foot soldiers, and their positioning suggested they understood military tactics. These were not amateur fighters, but experienced commanders who had survived years of warfare through intelligence and caution. Morrison made the call to engage. Chin settled into his shooting position, controlling his breathing as he had thousands of times before. The rifle was a precision instrument, custom-built for exactly this kind of long-range engagement. Every component had been selected and adjusted to maximize accuracy at extreme distances. The ammunition was match-grade, each round manufactured to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. The first shot took down the lead figure cleanly. The sound of the rifle reached the convoy several seconds after the bullet, creating confusion about the direction of the attack. Chin was already adjusting for his second target when something impossible happened. From somewhere even farther up the mountain, a single rifle shot echoed across the valley. One of Chin's targets dropped instantly, but the angle was all wrong. The shot had not come from their position. Morrison's team froze, scanning the heights above them with sudden urgency. Someone else was on the mountain, someone with the capability to make shots at distances that challenged even military snipers. Rodriguez spotted the muzzle flash first, a tiny spark of light from a position at least 3,500 meters away. The distance was so extreme that the flash appeared almost simultaneously with the sound of the shot. Chun, who had been preparing to engage the same target, lowered his rifle and stared through his scope in disbelief. At that range, with that elevation difference, the shot should have been impossible. The remaining members of the convoy scattered, diving for cover behind rocks and depressions. But their unknown sniper was not finished. A second shot rang out, and another figure fell. The precision was inhuman. No hesitation, no correction shots, just clean kills at a distance that pushed the absolute limits of ballistic physics. Morrison grabbed his radio, requesting immediate reconnaissance of the heights above their position. Drone operators scrambled to redirect their aircraft, but the terrain made thermal imaging difficult. The rocky slopes absorbed and reflected heat in patterns that confused their sensors. Whoever was up there understood not just shooting, but concealment. The convoy was now completely pinned down, caught between 2 sniper positions that commanded overlapping fields of fire. But instead of continuing the engagement, their mysterious ally simply vanished. No more shots, no movement, no thermal signatures. It was as if the mountain itself had swallowed the shooter. Chun continued to scan the distant position through his scope, but saw nothing. The angle required to make those shots suggested someone positioned on an almost vertical cliff face, in a location that would normally require climbing equipment and hours of careful ascent. Yet their invisible partner had somehow reached that position, engaged multiple targets with perfect accuracy, and disappeared without leaving any trace. The Tactical Operations Center was buzzing with confusion. Satellite imagery showed no friendly forces in the area. Special Operations Command had no units positioned at that elevation. The shots had definitely come from outside their perimeter, but from someone who clearly considered Morrison's team to be allies rather than targets. As the morning sun burned away the mist, Morrison made the decision to investigate. They would finish securing the convoy site and then attempt to reach the position where their mysterious ally had been shooting. It would require a dangerous climb up exposed terrain, but he needed answers. In his years of combat experience, he had never encountered anything like the precision he had witnessed. The climb took 2 hours, following trails that seemed to exist more in theory than practice. The air grew thin as they ascended, and the weight of their equipment made every step a challenge. Rodriguez, despite his usual bravado, was breathing hard by the time they reached the approximate position of the shots. What they found defied explanation. The shooting position was a narrow ledge barely wide enough for a single person, with a field of fire that commanded the entire valley below. But there were no brass casings, no scuff marks from a bipod, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. The rocks showed no scratches from equipment, and even their most experienced tracker could find no definitive footprints. Chun examined the position with the eye of a professional sniper. The angle was extraordinary, nearly 60 degrees of elevation difference. The distance to their original targets measured exactly 3,743 meters, according to his laser rangefinder. At that distance, accounting for altitude and atmospheric conditions, the bullet would have been in flight for nearly 8 seconds. The shooter would have needed to account for the Earth's rotation, the Coriolis effect, and wind patterns at multiple altitudes. But most disturbing of all was the realization that to reach this position, the shooter would have had to move through terrain that their own reconnaissance had declared impassable. The approach routes were all exposed to their observation, yet no one had seen any movement. It was as if their ally had materialized from the mountain itself. Morrison photographed the position from multiple angles while his team searched for any clue about their mysterious benefactor. They found a single indication that someone had been there, a small depression in the rock that might have been used to steady a rifle. But the rock was so hard that it would have taken considerable force to create even that minor indentation. The descent was more treacherous than the climb, requiring multiple rappelling points and careful navigation around loose rockfall zones. By the time they reached the convoy site, the sun was approaching its zenith, and the heat was making the thin air even more difficult to breathe. The Taliban fighters were all dead, killed with a precision that spoke of professional training. But the ballistics told a confusing story. Some of the wounds came from Chin's .338 Lapua rounds, easily identifiable by their characteristics. But others showed the signature of a different caliber entirely, something larger and older, with characteristics that the ballistics experts would later struggle to identify. Morrison collected what evidence he could, but the mountain had already begun to reclaim the scene. Wind was scattering any traces that might have revealed more about their mysterious ally. The bodies would be removed for identification, but the questions about the unknown sniper would persist. As they prepared to extract from the area, Morrison took one last look at the heights above them. Somewhere up there, someone with extraordinary skills had decided to help them complete their mission. But who and why remained as mysterious as the mountain mists that were already beginning to gather for the afternoon weather cycle. The report that Morrison filed would mark the beginning of an investigation that would consume intelligence analysts for months to come. The native ghost had announced her presence with a display of marksmanship that challenged everything the military thought it knew about long-range shooting. But this was only the beginning of a legend that would grow with each impossible shot, each mysterious disappearance, each encounter that left more questions than answers. In the valleys below, local villagers spoke in hushed tones about spirits that protected the mountains from invaders. They told stories that went back generations, about guardians who appeared when the land itself was threatened. Morrison's team had just encountered something that existed at the intersection of legend and reality, where ancient wisdom met modern warfare with results that no training manual could explain. The native ghost had chosen to reveal herself, and the hunt was about to begin. 3 weeks after the first encounter, intelligence reports began flooding into Special Operations Headquarters with accounts that seemed to exist at the boundary between military briefings and folklore. The reports came from different units, different locations, but they all described the same phenomenon: a sniper of impossible skill who appeared without warning and vanished without trace. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the intelligence officer tasked with investigating these incidents, spread the files across her desk in the secure facility at Bagram Air Base. Each report described shots that pushed the boundaries of what trained marksmen considered possible, distances that exceeded the effective range of most military rifles, positions that seemed to require superhuman climbing abilities, and always the complete absence of evidence that anyone had been there at all. The pattern that emerged was as puzzling as it was consistent. The mysterious sniper only engaged targets that posed immediate threats to American forces. Never civilians, never ambiguous situations, but always clear enemy combatants in the act of planning or executing attacks. It was as if someone with perfect intelligence and perfect moral judgment was moving through the Afghan mountains, dispensing justice with surgical precision. Captain Elena Vasquez, a ballistics expert flown in from Quantico, examined the recovered projectiles with growing bewilderment. The bullets were unlike anything in current military inventories. They appeared to be custom-loaded rounds fired from a rifle that belonged in a museum rather than a modern battlefield. Initial analysis suggested a .300 Winchester Magnum cartridge, but with modifications that indicated someone with extensive knowledge of both metallurgy and ballistics. The rifle itself remained a mystery. Satellite imagery and drone surveillance had captured no clear images of the weapon, but witness descriptions consistently mentioned an old-style hunting rifle with a wooden stock. The idea that someone was using what amounted to a grandfather's deer rifle to outshoot military snipers with state-of-the-art equipment was both humbling and terrifying. Morrison's team had been reassigned to investigate after their first encounter, and they found themselves tracking a ghost through terrain that seemed to actively resist their efforts. Every lead dissolved into dead ends. Every promising trail vanished into impossible geography. It was as if they were chasing someone who understood the mountain not as an obstacle to overcome, but as an ally to embrace. Sergeant Rodriguez had grown up hunting in the mountains of Colorado, and he considered himself capable of reading terrain as well as anyone in the military. But the tracks they occasionally found, when they found any at all, defied his understanding of how someone could move through such difficult country. The footprints appeared in places that required technical climbing to reach, yet showed no signs of rope marks or equipment usage. The psychological profile that emerged from their investigation was equally puzzling. Dr. James Wright, a behavioral analyst with extensive experience profiling enemy snipers, studied the pattern of engagements with growing fascination. The targets were always military-age males carrying weapons in hostile postures. The timing always coincided with immediate threats to American forces. The precision suggested someone with formal training, but the methodology was unlike anything taught in any known sniper school. Most intriguingly, several incidents suggested that their unknown ally possessed intelligence capabilities that rivaled those of major military organizations. Targets were engaged just moments before they would have been in position to attack American patrols. Ambush sites were cleared just hours before they would have been occupied. It was as if someone was reading Taliban communications and movements with an accuracy that embarrassed professional intelligence officers. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Master Sergeant William Thompson, a veteran of 6 deployments who was nearing retirement, approached Morrison with information that had been dismissed by previous investigators. Thompson had spent years building relationships with local village elders, and he had heard stories that might explain their mysterious ally. The elders spoke of Zara, a woman whose name was whispered rather than spoken aloud. Her story began 15 years earlier, when she was barely more than a child living in a remote village in the walking corridor. Taliban forces had swept through the area, executing anyone suspected of cooperating with government forces. Zara's father, a schoolteacher who had dared to educate girls, was among those killed in front of his family. But Zara's story diverged from the typical tragedy of Afghan warfare. Instead of being cowed into submission, she had disappeared into the mountains with nothing but her father's hunting rifle and an unquenchable thirst for justice. The villagers said she had been taught to shoot by her grandfather, who had fought the Soviets in these same mountains decades earlier. But her skills had developed far beyond anything her family could have imagined. Thompson's sources described a woman who had spent over a decade living in caves and hidden shelters, surviving on her knowledge of the land and her ability to move unseen through terrain that defeated trained soldiers. She had learned to read weather patterns, animal movements, and human behavior with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural. The mountains had become her weapon, and she wielded them with devastating effectiveness. The psychological transformation described by the villagers was as remarkable as her tactical evolution. Zara had become something more than human in their minds, a spirit of vengeance that embodied the land's resistance to foreign invasion. She targeted those who brought violence to her mountains, regardless of their nationality or affiliation. Taliban commanders lived in fear of her just as much as any foreign fighter. But The villagers also spoke of her code, a set of rules that governed when and how she used her lethal skills. She never harmed civilians, never engaged in conflicts that did not directly threaten innocent lives, and always disappeared before her presence could bring retribution on the communities that sheltered her. She had become a ghost, not just tactically, but socially, existing in the spaces between the various factions that controlled the region. Mitchell organized a meeting with tribal elders from 3 different valleys, using Thompson's contacts to arrange a gathering that would have been impossible through official channels. The conversation took place in a tea house in a village so remote that it appeared on no military maps, conducted through interpreters who spoke dialects that few outsiders had ever learned. The elders confirmed Thompson's information, but added details that painted an even more extraordinary picture. Zara had developed not just marksmanship skills, but an understanding of modern warfare that came from years of observation and analysis. She studied American tactics, learned from Taliban mistakes, and adapted constantly to the changing nature of the conflict. One elder, whose weathered hands shook as he served tea, described seeing her preparing for a shot that would later be recorded as the longest confirmed kill in the region's history. She had spent 3 days in position, not waiting for the target, but studying wind patterns, temperature changes, and the subtle ways that light and shadow moved across the valley floor. Her rifle, the elders confirmed, was indeed a Winchester Model 70, inherited from her grandfather who had used it against Soviet forces. But Zara had modified it extensively, working with village metalworkers to create custom ammunition and adjust the barrel for the extreme conditions in which she operated. The weapon had become as much a part of her as her own hands, and she could disassemble and reassemble it in complete darkness. The psychological profile that emerged from these conversations painted a picture of someone who had transcended normal human limitations through a combination of necessity, training, and an almost mystical connection to the landscape. Zara had become the perfect sniper not through formal education, but through a 15-year apprenticeship to the mountains themselves. But the elders also warned that attempts to find her would be futile. She moved through a network of caves and shelters that had been used by fighters for centuries, following routes that were known only to those born to the region. More importantly, she was protected by the unspoken loyalty of people who saw her as their own defense against the chaos that surrounded them. As Mitchell compiled her report, she found herself facing questions that had no precedent in military doctrine. How do you classify an ally who operates completely outside normal command structures? How do you protect someone who refuses protection? How do you coordinate with an asset who communicates only through action? The native ghost had become more than a tactical advantage. She was a symbol of something that American forces struggled to understand. In a war defined by technology and overwhelming firepower, she represented the power of knowledge, patience, and an intimate understanding of the battlefield that no amount of training could replicate. But as intelligence reports continued to accumulate, it became clear that Zara's activities were attracting attention from sources far more dangerous than curious American forces. Taliban commanders had begun offering substantial bounties for information about her location. Foreign fighters with specialized training were being brought in specifically to hunt her. The ghost who had terrorized her enemies for over a decade was about to face challenges that would test every skill she had developed in her solitary war. The hunt was intensifying, and soon both sides would learn that legends, once awakened, are almost impossible to kill. The Taliban's response to the native ghost came in the form of Ahmad Hassan, a Pakistani sniper whose reputation for brutality was matched only by his skill with a rifle. Hassan had cut his teeth fighting Indian forces in Kashmir, where he had developed techniques for mountain warfare that made him valuable to insurgent groups across the region. His arrival in the walking corridor marked a significant escalation in the deadly game that had been playing out in the Afghan peaks. Hassan brought with him not just expertise, but resources. His rifle was a custom-built weapon based on the Chetak M200, capable of accurate fire at distances exceeding 2,000 meters. More importantly, he brought a team of spotters and support personnel who understood counter-sniper operations. The Taliban had decided that the ghost's reign of terror required a professional solution. Morrison's team intercepted communications about Hassan's arrival through signals intelligence, but the information raised more questions than it answered. The Taliban rarely invested such resources in hunting individual targets. preferring to rely on numbers and local knowledge to overwhelm their enemies. The decision to bring in a specialist suggested that Zara had become more than just a tactical problem. She was now a strategic threat that required elimination at any cost. The psychological warfare began immediately. Hassan's team started targeting civilians in villages suspected of supporting the Ghost, using precision shooting to send a message about the consequences of providing aid to their enemy. The tactics were designed to force Zara into the open by threatening the people she had spent years protecting. But Hassan had underestimated both his target's tactical sophistication and her emotional discipline. Instead of rushing to defend the villages directly, Zara began a campaign of harassment that demonstrated her superior knowledge of the terrain. Hassan's support personnel started disappearing during routine movements, picked off by shots that seemed to come from the landscape itself. The first direct confrontation came 3 weeks after Hassan's arrival. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value Taliban meeting was scheduled to take place in a village near the Pakistani border. Multiple American units were positioning to intercept the gathering when long-range reconnaissance detected movement in the mountains above the target site. Morrison's team was providing overwatch from a position 2 kilometers away when they spotted Hassan's distinctive rifle silhouette on a ridge that commanded the entire valley. Through his scope, Chun could see the Pakistani sniper adjusting his position to cover the same targets that had drawn American attention. But Hassan was not alone. Thermal imaging revealed at least 3 additional personnel in supporting positions. The tactical situation was unprecedented. American forces were preparing to engage Taliban leaders while a hostile sniper team occupied the high ground above them. But somewhere in the maze of peaks and valleys surrounding the area, the native Ghost was almost certainly present as well. The village below had become the focal point for a 3-way engagement that would test every participant's skill and nerve. Hassan fired first, targeting the Taliban leader as he emerged from a building in the village center. The shot was perfectly placed, demonstrating the Pakistani's considerable abilities. But before Hassan could shift to a second target, a rifle shot echoed from somewhere far above his position. One of Hassan's spotters collapsed instantly, struck by a bullet that had traveled over 3,200 meters to find its mark. The counter-sniper battle that followed was unlike anything recorded in military history. Hassan's team tried to locate their attacker using electronic detection equipment, but Zara had learned to minimize her signature in ways that frustrated their technology. She moved constantly, never firing more than 1 shot from any position, always maintaining multiple escape routes. Morrison's team found themselves observers to a deadly chess match played across impossible terrain. Hassan demonstrated why he had earned his fearsome reputation, using suppressing fire and coordinated movement to try to flush his opponent from her hiding places. But Zara's responses showed tactical sophistication that matched her marksmanship skills. Instead of engaging Hassan directly, she began targeting his support structure. Radio operators, ammunition carriers, and vehicle drivers started falling to shots that came without warning from positions that seemed to exist outside the normal geometry of the battlefield. Hassan's technological advantages meant nothing against an opponent who moved like smoke through landscape she knew better than her own thoughts. The psychological pressure on Hassan's team was immense. They had come to the mountains expecting to hunt a skilled but ultimately amateur opponent. Instead, they found themselves being systematically dismantled by someone who fought with the patience of a hunter and the strategic thinking of a professional soldier. Morale collapsed as Hassan realized that his conventional counter-sniper techniques were useless against an enemy who refused to play by conventional rules. Chun, watching through his scope, saw Hassan make the mistake that would cost him his life. Frustrated by his inability to locate his target, the Pakistani sniper broke cover to move to a new position. For just a moment, his silhouette was visible against the sky as he crossed a narrow ridge. The range was over 3,600 meters, requiring Hassan to be visible for less than 3 seconds as he navigated the crossing. The shot came from so far away that Chun never saw the muzzle flash. Hassan simply crumpled and fell, struck down by a bullet that had traveled for nearly 9 seconds to reach its target. The precision was inhuman, a moving target at extreme range, engaged from a position that Chun's instruments could not even locate. With their leader dead, Hassan's remaining team members made the decision to withdraw rather than continue a battle they could not win. But Zara was not finished with them. As they attempted to extract through valleys they believed were safe, they found their routes blocked by rockfall that seemed too precisely placed to be natural. The ghost was herding them toward positions where she could engage them at will. The final confrontation took place in a narrow canyon where the fleeing Taliban fighters believed they had found safety. The walls were too steep for effective sniper fire, and the winding path provided multiple concealment opportunities. But Zara had anticipated their route and positioned herself at the canyon's exit, where she could engage targets as they emerged into open ground. Morrison's team, following the action through drone surveillance, watched as the remaining members of Hassan's team were methodically eliminated. Each shot demonstrated not just marksmanship skill, but tactical understanding that came from years of studying how trained fighters move through difficult terrain. Zara had learned to read human behavior with the same precision that she read weather patterns and wind direction. The aftermath of Hassan's elimination sent shockwaves through Taliban command structures across the region. The Pakistani sniper had been brought in specifically to solve the native ghost problem, and his failure demonstrated that conventional military solutions were inadequate against an opponent who operated by different rules entirely. But the engagement had also revealed something important to American forces. Through careful analysis of the tactical sequence, Morrison's team had identified patterns in Zara's movement and positioning that suggested she was working from a base of operations somewhere in the remote peaks above the walking corridor. The location would be almost impossible to reach, but it represented the first concrete lead they had developed in months of investigation. Colonel Mitchell authorized a reconnaissance mission using the military's most advanced mountain warfare specialists. The team would not attempt to capture or engage the native ghost, but simply to confirm her location and assess the feasibility of making contact. After witnessing her capabilities in action, Mitchell had begun to consider the possibility that Zara might be recruited as an asset rather than treated as an unknown factor. The mission would require climbing skills that pushed the limits of what was possible at high altitude, but it represented their best opportunity to solve the mystery that had consumed intelligence resources for months. The native ghost had demonstrated that she was willing to work alongside American forces when their objectives aligned, but the communication remained entirely one-sided. As Morrison's team prepared for what might be the most dangerous reconnaissance mission of their careers, they found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about warfare in the Afghan mountains. The native ghost had shown them that technology and training, while important, were no substitute for the kind of intimate knowledge that could only be earned through years of living as part of the landscape itself. The hunt was about to enter its most dangerous phase, where hunters and hunted would finally meet face-to-face in terrain that had defeated armies for centuries. What they would discover would challenge every assumption about loyalty, skill, and the true meaning of home ground advantage in modern warfare. The ascent began before dawn, with Morrison's team moving through terrain that existed at the very limits of human endurance. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the military's leading expert in high-altitude operations, led the climb using routes that appeared on no maps and required equipment that pushed the boundaries of current technology. Every step took them further into a world where the normal rules of combat ceased to apply. The intelligence gathered from Hassan's elimination had provided them with a general area to search, but the scope of their mission remained enormous. They were looking for someone who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of invisibility in landscape that offered 10,000 hiding places. The mathematical probability of success approached zero, but Mitchell had authorized the mission based on something that transcended normal tactical calculations. Rodriguez, despite his experience in mountain warfare, found himself struggling with altitude and terrain that seemed designed to defeat human passage. The routes they followed showed signs of use, but the wear patterns suggested someone who moved through this country with efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. Footprints appeared and disappeared according to no pattern he could discern, as if their quarry could control her interaction with the physical world. Chun carried detection equipment that could identify human presence at considerable distances, but the readings he obtained made no sense according to conventional understanding. The signatures appeared and vanished in ways that suggested either equipment malfunction or someone who understood electronic surveillance better than the engineers who designed the systems. On the second day of their ascent, they discovered the first evidence that they were approaching something significant. A carefully concealed shelter, built into the rock face with such skill that it was invisible from more than 10 meters away, showed signs of recent occupation. The construction demonstrated knowledge of both traditional mountain survival and modern material science. Santos examined the shelter with growing amazement. The design incorporated principles that she had never seen in any military manual, using the mountain's natural thermal properties to maintain comfortable temperatures while remaining completely hidden from infrared detection. Whoever had built this sanctuary understood the physics of concealment better than specialists who had dedicated their careers to the subject. Inside the shelter, they found evidence of the native ghost's true sophistication. Maps marked with tactical notations showed an understanding of regional military movements that rivaled their own intelligence capabilities. The markings indicated observation posts, supply routes, and communication patterns for both American and Taliban forces. Zara had been conducting her own intelligence operation with resources that amounted to nothing more than patience and extraordinary observational skills. But, most significantly, they found equipment that revealed the true scope of her capabilities. A custom-built ballistic computer, constructed from salvage electronics, had been programmed with atmospheric data specific to dozens of shooting positions throughout the region. The device incorporated wind patterns, temperature variations, and altitude corrections with precision that matched anything available to military snipers. Morrison realized they were looking at the workspace of someone who had transcended the normal limitations of individual combat effectiveness. Zara had become a one-person intelligence and operations center capable of collecting information, analyzing threats, and executing precision strikes with resources that would have been considered inadequate for a squad-sized element. The breakthrough came on the third day, when Santos spotted movement on a ridge that should have been impossible to reach without technical climbing equipment. Through binoculars, she could make out a figure moving with fluid grace across terrain that had challenged their entire team. The person appeared to be carrying a rifle, but moved without the careful deliberation that characterized soldiers navigating difficult ground. Morrison made the decision to approach openly rather than attempting concealment. Their presence had almost certainly been detected hours earlier, and any attempt at stealth would be seen as hostile rather than diplomatic. He instructed his team to display their weapons in non-threatening positions while advancing along the most obvious route available. The meeting took place on a narrow ledge that provided commanding views of 3 separate valleys. Zara appeared as if materialized from the rock itself. Her Winchester Model 70 held in a position that could transition to lethal use in a fraction of a second. She was smaller than Morrison had expected, but moved with the controlled tension of someone completely comfortable with violence. Her appearance challenged every preconception they had formed during months of investigation. Years of mountain living had left her lean and weathered, but her eyes held an intelligence that would have been remarkable in any context. She wore clothing that combined traditional Afghan textiles with modern technical fabrics, creating camouflage that worked perfectly with the surrounding landscape. The conversation that followed was conducted through a combination of English, Dari, and hand signals. Zara's English was accented but precise, learned from years of monitoring radio communications and interrogating captured equipment. Her questions demonstrated tactical awareness that impressed even Morrison's experienced team. She wanted to know about American intentions in the region, about rotation schedules, and about rules of engagement. But her inquiries went beyond simple intelligence gathering to reveal someone who thought strategically about the long-term implications of military actions. Zara understood that every tactical decision created ripple effects that influenced the lives of people who had no voice in the conflicts that shaped their world. Morrison found himself explaining American objectives to someone who knew more about regional politics than most intelligence officers. Zara's perspective was shaped by 15 years of watching various factions fight for control of territory that she considered home in ways that transcended any political boundary. Her loyalty was to the land and its people rather than to any flag or ideology. The tactical discussion revealed the true scope of her capabilities. Zara described shots she had made at ranges that exceeded anything in Morrison's experience, using calculations performed entirely in her head with accuracy that matched computer-assisted systems. Her understanding of ballistics incorporated factors that military manuals treated as secondary considerations, but which became critical at the extreme ranges where she operated. But the conversation also revealed the psychological cost of her solitary war. 15 years of constant vigilance had left her with reflexes that never fully relaxed and awareness that bordered on paranoia. She trusted no one completely and planned every interaction with escape routes that reflected her understanding that today's ally might become tomorrow's enemy. Chun, as the team's designated marksman, found himself engaged in a technical discussion that challenged his professional understanding. Zara's modifications to her Winchester had created a weapon system that performed beyond its original specifications through a combination of custom ammunition, barrel modifications, and shooting techniques that she had developed through years of experimentation. Her ammunition was hand-loaded using components salvaged from various sources, creating rounds optimized for the specific atmospheric conditions in her operational area. The powder charges were calculated to provide maximum accuracy at the extreme ranges where she operated, using pressure curves that she had mapped through careful observation rather than formal testing. The scope mounted on her rifle was a masterpiece of improvised engineering, combining lenses from multiple sources with custom-built mechanical adjustments that provided precise ranging capabilities. The reticle had been modified to account for the specific ballistic characteristics of her ammunition, creating a system perfectly matched to her requirements. Rodriguez, despite his initial skepticism, found himself genuinely impressed by Zara's tactical innovations. Her movement techniques incorporated elements from traditional hunting, military training, and rock climbing to create a methodology for navigating impossible terrain that no training manual had ever described. She had learned to read landscape features that escaped his experienced eye, finding routes through country that appeared to offer no passage. The discussion of tactics revealed someone who thought about warfare in terms that transcended normal military categories. Zara fought not to control territory or achieve political objectives, but to maintain balance in a region where balance meant survival for communities that had existed longer than any of the modern states that claimed authority over them. As the day progressed, Morrison realized that their mission had evolved beyond intelligence gathering to something approaching negotiation. Zara was clearly assessing whether American forces represented allies, threats, or simply another faction to be monitored and occasionally manipulated. Her questions probed not just their immediate intentions, but their understanding of the complex relationships that govern life in the border regions. The meeting concluded with an exchange that would have been impossible to explain in any military manual. Zara provided Morrison with intelligence about Taliban movements that would prevent two planned attacks on American patrols. In return, Morrison shared information about Pakistani supply routes that she could use to intercept weapons shipments intended for her enemies. As his team prepared to descend, Morrison found himself looking back at someone who embodied everything that made warfare in Afghanistan so challenging for conventional forces. Zara represented intimate knowledge of terrain, culture, and tactics that could not be learned in any training facility or gained through any amount of technological advantage. The native ghost had shown them that the most effective warriors were not always those with the best equipment or the most formal training, but those who understood that true mastery came from becoming part of the battlefield itself. The hunt was ending, but the legend would continue to grow with each impossible shot that reminded the world that some advantages could never be bought, only earned through years of dedication to a craft that demanded everything in return. 6 months after Morrison's team made contact with the native ghost, the intelligence-sharing relationship had evolved into something unprecedented in modern warfare. Zara provided information that prevented dozens of attacks on American forces, while receiving tactical support that helped her protect the villages that had sheltered her during her 15-year campaign. The arrangement existed entirely outside official channels, known only to a handful of personnel with the highest security clearances. Colonel Mitchell found herself managing an asset who operated according to principles that challenged every assumption about modern military cooperation. Zara refused any form of payment, rejected offers of equipment upgrades, and maintained complete operational independence. Her cooperation was based entirely on shared objectives rather than command authority, creating a partnership that required constant negotiation and mutual respect. The relationship was tested when intelligence reports indicated that foreign fighters were being brought into the region specifically to eliminate the native ghost. The bounty on her head had reached levels that attracted some of the world's most skilled assassins, including former Special Forces operators who understood mountain warfare and counter-sniper techniques. Unlike Hassan's conventional approach, These new hunters employed tactics designed specifically to counter Zara's advantages. They used electronic warfare equipment to disrupt her communications monitoring, thermal masking to defeat her observation capabilities, and movement techniques that minimize their exposure to long-range fire. The technological gap that had always favored conventional forces was finally being applied in systematic attempts to eliminate her. Morrison's team provided what assistance they could within the constraints of plausible deniability, but Zara's survival ultimately depended on skills that no external support could replicate. The psychological pressure was immense. For the first time in 15 years, she faced opponents who understood her methods and had the resources to counter them. The campaign that followed demonstrated why the native ghost had become legendary among both allies and enemies. Instead of retreating to her deepest sanctuaries, Zara launched a preemptive offensive that showcased tactical innovations developed during her years of solitary warfare. She began targeting the hunter's support infrastructure, eliminating guides, drivers, and communication personnel with precision that demoralized entire hunter teams. Her understanding of human psychology proved as deadly as her marksmanship skills. Zara would allow hunter teams to penetrate deep into her territory before striking, creating the impression that their quarry was always just beyond reach. The psychological effect of operating in country where every ridge might conceal death was devastating to fighters accustomed to technological superiority. Chun, monitoring the situation through intelligence reports and occasional radio contact, marveled at Zara's tactical evolution. She had learned to use the hunter's own technology against them, employing captured electronic equipment to monitor their communications while feeding them false information that led them into carefully prepared kill zones. The student had become the master, turning every advantage her enemies possessed into a weapon for their own destruction. The decisive engagement came when a team of former Russian Spetsnaz operators, hired through channels that traced back to Pakistani intelligence services, attempted to siege Zara's primary base of operations. They brought heavy weapons, electronic warfare capabilities, and enough personnel to maintain continuous surveillance of all known escape routes. The operation was planned with military precision and executed with professional competence. But the Russian team had made the same mistake that had defeated every previous attempt to capture the native ghost. They assumed that superior technology and formal training would overcome local knowledge and improvised tactics. Zara had spent months preparing for exactly this type of assault, using her intelligence network to identify the threat long before the hunters reached her territory. Instead of defending her base, she abandoned it entirely and allowed the Russian team to occupy positions that she had deliberately prepared for their arrival. The cave system they believed they had seized was actually an elaborate trap, rigged with explosives and designed to become a tomb for anyone foolish enough to enter without understanding its true purpose. Morrison's team watched through satellite imagery as Zara eliminated the siege force through a combination of long-range shooting and tactical engineering that demonstrated her mastery of both traditional and improvised warfare techniques. The engagement lasted less than 6 hours, but its psychological impact resonated throughout the international community of professional killers. The message was clear. The native ghost had evolved beyond being merely a skilled sniper into something approaching a force of nature that could not be defeated through conventional means. The mountains themselves had become her weapons, and she wielded them with a sophistication that surpassed anything achieved by formally trained military units. But victory came with a cost that extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Zara's activities had attracted attention from intelligence agencies that viewed her as either an asset to be recruited or a threat to be eliminated. The simple life she had known was disappearing, replaced by constant pressure from forces that possessed resources far exceeding anything she had faced before. Mitchell received authorization to offer Zara extraction to the United States, where her skills could be employed in service of American interests while providing her with security that no mountain sanctuary could match. The proposal represented recognition that the native ghost had become too valuable to lose and too dangerous to leave uncontrolled in an increasingly volatile region. The meeting to discuss extraction took place in the same location where Morrison had first made contact months earlier. Zara arrived with her usual silent efficiency, but Chin noticed subtle changes that suggested the psychological strain of constant warfare was finally affecting even her extraordinary resilience. The years of solitary combat were leaving marks that no amount of tactical skill could heal. Her response to the extraction offer revealed the depth of her connection to the land that had shaped her into something unique in modern warfare. Zara understood the advantages that American resources could provide, but she also recognized that her effectiveness was inseparable from the environment where she had learned to fight. The mountains were not just her battlefield. They were the source of everything that made her formidable. The conversation revealed something that Mitchell had suspected, but never confirmed. Zara's campaign was not driven by revenge or ideology, but by a sense of responsibility to communities that had no other protection against the violence that plagued the region. She saw herself as a guardian whose duty could not be transferred to others or fulfilled from a distance. Rodriguez, who had grown up in a small mountain town, understood the connection that kept Zara bound to her homeland despite the dangers it represented. Her relationship to the landscape was spiritual as well as tactical, based on knowledge that had been passed down through generations and could not be replicated in any other environment. The final agreement reflected the complexity of Zara's position and the military's need to maintain contact with an asset of unprecedented value. She would remain in the mountains, but accept limited support that enhanced her capabilities without compromising her independence. Communication protocols were established that allowed for coordination without exposing her to electronic surveillance. In return, Zara agreed to provide advance warning of major terrorist activities and to assist in operations that threatened regional stability. The arrangement required trust that transcended normal military relationships, based on mutual respect rather than traditional command structures. As Morrison's team prepared for their final departure from Zara's territory, they found themselves changed by their exposure to someone who embodied principles that modern warfare often overlooked. The native ghost had shown them that effectiveness in combat came not from technology alone, but from understanding that linked tactical skill with strategic vision and personal commitment. The legend of the 3,700-meter kill had evolved into something larger than a single extraordinary shot. It represented the power of individual dedication applied with intelligence and precision over time. Zara had demonstrated that one person who truly understood their environment could influence events on a scale normally reserved for major military units. Chun took one last look through his scope at the peaks where the native ghost would continue her solitary war against forces that threatened the people she protected. The mountains themselves seemed different now, no longer just terrain to be crossed, but living entities that responded to those who understood their secrets. The official reports would describe successful intelligence cooperation and tactical coordination, but the true story was about something that transcended military categories. The native ghost had become a symbol of what was possible when skill, dedication, and intimate knowledge combined to create capabilities that exceeded the sum of their parts. As their helicopter lifted off for the final time, Morrison realized that they were leaving behind someone who represented the best and most dangerous aspects of modern warfare, the power of an individual who refused to be defeated by superior numbers or advanced technology. The native ghost would continue her watch from peaks that touched the sky, ready to demonstrate once again that some legends are too powerful to die and too valuable to ignore. The hunt was over, but the story would continue as long as there were mountains to defend, and people who understood that sometimes the most effective weapon is an unbreakable spirit armed with perfect knowledge of home ground. In the thin air of the Hindu Kush, where eagles struggle to fly and men fear to climb, the native ghost remained what she had always been, a reminder that courage and skill, properly applied, could change the course of history one impossible shot at a time.